Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unraveling the monumental and, honestly, deeply paradoxical legacy of American industrialist Henry Ford. Now, you probably know him as the ultimate car guy, right? The pioneer who brought the automobile to the masses. But his full story? It's way more complex than that. It is a massive collision of brilliant innovation and really dangerous extremism that, quite literally, shaped both the darkest and brightest parts of the 20th century. So let's dive into this fascinating duality. Our explainer today tackles a really profound question. How does a man who basically single-handedly built the American middle class also use his incredible wealth and influence to finance hate? We're going to stick strictly to the historical record today to see how these two completely opposing identities existed inside the exact same person. To really wrap our heads around his global influence, we got to start with this staggering number, 15,007,034. That is the total production run of the famous Model T. To put that into perspective for you, this single vehicle design held the world record for the most cars sold for the next 45 years. No kidding. It wasn't just a product, it was an absolute phenomenon that physically redrew our cities and our roads. Part 1, Putting the World on Wheels. Let's look at how this unbelievable empire actually began. Now, what's kind of wild is that Ford was definitely not an overnight success. Actually, he went through multiple, highly public corporate failures before he finally cracked the code on mass production. His 1899 Detroit Automobile Company? Totally dissolved. He tried again in 1901, but walked away after a bitter argument with investors. And fun fact, that abandoned company actually went on to become Cadillac. It wasn't until his third attempt in 1903 that he finally found his footing, which led to the massive debut of the Model T in 1908. What he pulled off next didn't just change cars, it completely revolutionized global industry. We call it Fordism. By bringing in the moving assembly line in 1913, Ford basically brought the work directly to the man. He figured out how to build incredibly complex machines faster and way cheaper than anyone else in human history. It was a totally new philosophy of mass production. And the dominance was just total. By 1918, a staggering 50% of all cars on the road in the United States were Model Ts. Half of them. And if you're wondering why this matters today, it's because this exact model, hyperscaling a product to completely capture an entire market, well, that became the foundational blueprint for the modern megacorporations and tech giants we see today. He achieved this total monopoly through relentless, almost obsessive efficiency. You know how most things get more expensive over time? Well, Ford deliberately dropped the price of the Model T from $825 at launch to just $360 by 1916. He firmly believed that every single person working in his factories should actually be able to afford the very car they were building. Part 2, Creating the Modern Workplace. Because to make these cars at that kind of unprecedented volume and at that shockingly low price point, he had to completely reinvent how humans worked. He spearheaded this concept known as welfare capitalism. Back in 1914, Ford completely shocked the industrial world by rolling out the $5 daily wage. That was double the going rate at the time. But don't get it twisted, this wasn't just out of the goodness of his heart. The assembly line was so brutal and mind-numbingly monotonous that worker turnover was literally threatening to shut down his production. This was a highly calculated, ruthless strategy to keep his top talent. Later, he brought in the 40-hour workweek, proving that if you give workers decent leisure time and high pay, it actually booms the local economy. But there was a huge, almost Orwellian catch to this progressive system. We see this stark duality right on the factory floor. To actually qualify for that amazing $5 wage, you had to let Ford's social department into your life. This was a wildly invasive branch of the company that sent investigators to literally spy on workers' private lives, checking their bank accounts, inspecting their homes for cleanliness, and coming down hard on things like drinking or gambling. And if that wasn't enough, he used a notorious service department to strictly and sometimes violently enforce factory discipline. This intense need for absolute control led to a seriously fierce anti-union stance. Ford once openly called labor unions the worst thing that ever struck the earth, and his intimidation tactics repeatedly ended in tragedy. In 1932, security guards fired on unemployed workers during the Ford Hunger March, leaving 5 people dead. 5 years later, union members were severely beaten by his guys in the Battle of the Overpass. Ford was so unbelievably stubborn. He threatened to dissolve his entire empire rather than negotiate. Actually, it took his wife, Clara, giving him a definitive ultimatum in 1941 to finally force his hand to sign a union contract. Part 3. The Dirk Crusade. This brings us to the really hard pivot of our explainer. We're transitioning now from the brilliant architect of modern manufacturing to an extremist who actively weaponized his immense wealth and platform. In 1918, Ford bought his hometown newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and he explicitly used this massive platform to adapt the completely fabricated Protocols of the Elders of Zion for an American audience. He pushed out 91 separate issues claiming a vast Jewish conspiracy, effectively force-feeding his deeply anti-Semitic views to 700,000 regular readers. Later on, he bound these articles into a 4-volume set titled The International Jew, which sold over 500,000 copies and was translated into languages all over the globe. Now, what you really need to take away from this is how localized media can have totally devastating global consequences. The historical record shows his rhetoric crossed the Atlantic with terrifying success. Ford was actually the only American mentioned favorably in Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. And in a 1931 interview, Hitler explicitly stated, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration." He even kept a life-size portrait of the American industrialist right behind his desk in Munich. Just let that sink in. The deadly, tangible impact of Ford's publications was clearly confirmed later at the Nuremberg trials following World War II. Baldur von Schirach, a convicted Hitler youth leader who facilitated the deportation of tens of thousands to concentration camps, testified under oath that reading Ford's The International Jew was the decisive factor in radicalizing him and his entire generation. Part 4. War and Global Ambitions. Let's see how this extremist ideology bled into his incredibly confusing stance on global conflicts as the world plunged back into war. Ford's geopolitical footprint is honestly utterly bizarre and full of massive contradictions. On one hand, he thought war was just a terrible waste of economic resources. He even funded this highly mocked peace ship that sailed to Europe in 1915, basically trying to single-handedly negotiate an end to World War I. But on the other hand, leading up to World War II, his European subsidiaries were actively doing business with Nazi Germany, even manufacturing war material for them, while he was sitting on the board of an isolationist committee back home. Yet when the U.S. finally entered the war, he rapidly pivoted his entire empire to become the ultimate cornerstone of the Allied effort. And when he finally did commit to the Allies, he applied that same Fordism to aviation with completely devastating efficiency. He built the Willow Run facility, which was the largest assembly line in the world at the time. By 1944, this massive plant was cranking out B-24 bombers at a blinding speed of 1 aircraft every 58 minutes. Ford ultimately produced half of all the B-24s used in the entire war. Part 5. A Complicated Legacy. As we get to his final years, the massive contradictions of Ford's life start to completely overwhelm both him and the global company he built. His final tenure playing out is essentially a corporate thriller. In 1943, his son Edsel tragically died of cancer. So an ailing Henry Ford, who was suffering from strokes and a fading memory, stubbornly took control again. By 1944, his incompetence at the helm meant the company was bleeding a staggering $10 million a month. It got so incredibly dire that in 1945, his wife Clara and daughter-in-law Eleanor essentially staged an internal coup. They threatened to liquidate their stock if he didn't hand the company over to his grandson, Henry Ford II, immediately. Henry Ford passed away in 1947. He left behind this vast industrial empire that quite literally put the world on wheels, revolutionized modern labor with the 40-hour workweek, and heavily armed the democratic forces in World War II. But that exact same legacy is permanently stained by his promotion of dangerous conspiracy theories and awards like the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, which he proudly accepted from the Third Reich back in 1938. As we wrap up this explainer, we want to leave you with a deeply unresolvable tension. When we look back at historical titans, we are so often forced to hold two completely opposing truths in our heads at exactly the same time. Can we ever truly separate the brilliant architect of the modern world from the hateful extremist who helped fracture it? It's a tough question, and one history still struggles to answer. Thanks for hanging out with us today, and keep asking the hard questions.